This is the new M3 MacBook Air, and honestly, I debated whether or not I was going to review this thing at all. After all, we've already seen the M3 chip in the MacBook Pro and the iMac, so we kind of know what the story is all about, and really the only major update, and major is a strong word, that the actual MacBook Air itself received is a new coating that is supposedly more fingerprint resistant, which of course is what I got. But there is more to the story because the M3 MacBook Air has created a ripple effect, if you will. There are now discounts that can be had on other MacBook Airs because of this one's existence. So, of course, we can't review the M3 MacBook Air in a vacuum. It is existent in the context of other Apple Silicon machines. So let's do some testing. Let's see how much of an improvement this is over the now discounted M2 MacBook Air, and we'll see if this is worth buying at all. That's gotta be one of the fastest unboxings I've ever seen, but again,
use English as the main language.
Shh. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing all set up, and we're gonna see if this is worth the $100 premium over the M2 chip that you can get in this basically exact same form factor. So this new MacBook Air has a lot to live up to because the M2 and the M1 MacBook Airs have been absolutely phenomenal. They are the go-to laptop to buy. So let's jump in by addressing the number one criticism that I know people had for the M2 MacBook Pro, and that is the storage speed. It was a huge controversy in the tech sphere because Apple decided to use a single 256GB NAND instead of two 128s, and that meant that the SSDs on the M2s were significantly slower. So has anything changed? Well, I ran Blackmagic's disk speed test, and the results were really weird. The M3 MacBook Air was all over the place. In some runs, it was as much as twice as fast as the M2 MacBook Air, but other times it was paralyzingly slow, getting as low as 200 megabytes per second. But it seems like overall, the SSD does appear to be faster. Other YouTubers like Greg's Gadgets posted on Twitter that the M2 MacBook Air's SSD was significantly faster, so I decided to do a real-world test, copying a 50GB Final Cut Pro library from one machine to the other. Now, the M2 MacBook Air took 31.2 seconds to transfer this file to an external hard drive. The M3 took 24.1 seconds, so that is pretty noticeably quicker, especially given that that's only a 30-second test. However, the M1 MacBook Air, which is more than 3 years old at this point, did the same transfer in 18.5 seconds, which means that the M3 MacBook Air, the brand new machine, is still behind where Apple was with their first generation of Apple Silicon machines. Now, is this some massive problem that would prevent me from recommending the MacBook? No, but it is frustrating because the MacBook Air is now a very capable machine. Back in the Intel days, MacBook Airs weren't really anything more than a basic machine for students and for web browsing and stuff like that. But now you can actually do legitimate work on these things, so it's just a bit of a bummer that Apple is still cheaping out on these SSDs. But let's talk about other performance because the M3 chip is not new, but it is new to the MacBook Air and being fanless. So I decided to run Cinebench 2024, which revealed another interesting quirk of this machine. In my initial run, the M3 MacBook Air did outperform the M2, but not by as much as the M2 does the M1. So an incremental boost, but nothing too spectacular. And on my second run, I actually found that they were nearly tied. The M2 MacBook Air dropped from 539 to 538, but the M3 dropped from 586 to 556. And anecdotally, the M3 MacBook Air did feel warmer, so it seems like for short bursty tasks, you're going to get a bit more performance, but that comes at the cost of thermals and throttling. In fact, speaking of the serious work that you can now do on these MacBook Airs, I fired up Final Cut Pro and exported a pretty beefy project in ProRes, 59 gigabytes, and it took 6 minutes and 56 seconds on the M1 MacBook Air compared to 6.5 minutes on the M2. That's a decent improvement, but the M3 kind of destroyed my expectations here. 4 minutes, 43 seconds. This was an impressive difference and is definitely worth considering if Final Cut Pro is something that you are going to be using a lot. I think the story that we're kind of putting together here for this MacBook Air is if you have a specific case where you will benefit from these improvements, it's worth considering. Likewise, if you're doing stuff that's graphics intensive, the M3 chip's ray tracing support might be of benefit to you. And even if you're not, it is a little bit more powerful. In GFX Bench Aztec Extreme, I found 31 FPS on the M1 MacBook Air compared to 39 and then 44 on the M3. So we see a pretty linear progression here. Now keep in mind, this is not going to be including any ray tracing because that's just GFX Bench, but the M3 chip does have a more powerful GPU, and I should specify that all of these machines are the base models with the binned GPUs, so everything is even and comparable. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the M3 chip, which is faster in other MacBooks, is also faster in this MacBook. But the key difference is that you can still buy the M2 MacBook Air brand new from Apple for $100 less than this. And perhaps smarter, you could buy one refurbished for $850. That's a savings of $250 for what is externally a nearly identical device. So the big question is, when you have these three phenomenal laptops, the M1, the M2, and the M3, which do you pick? Well, I think I know a method. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a MacBook by its function key. If it hollers, let it go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Okay, M2, there you go. You know, the funny part is that is actually what I was gonna recommend, ironically. So here's the deal. When it comes down to these three devices, there's really not that much difference because they're all so freaking good. The M1 MacBook Air has been the king since it came out, and then the M2 MacBook Air became the king, and now the M3 MacBook Air, I mean, de facto, it's gotta be the king at some point. But I think the trick is to always buy a previous model at a discount because the value is just unbelievable. I mean, you can get the M1 MacBook Air for $760 from Apple. Now, personally, I think it's actually worth the $90 upgrade to go for a refurbished M2 MacBook Air. And that's only because I really love the new design. Having MagSafe frees up one of your USB-C ports. The display is larger and brighter, and it's thinner and lighter. Now, do I wish the SSD wasn't slower than the M1 MacBook Air? Yeah, absolutely. But for $850, this isn't a machine that I'm realistically going to be using for super intense pro tasks, especially with a 256 gigabyte SSD. In fact, I know a lot of people will complain that for all of these devices over the past 4, 7, 8 years, we've had a standard of 8 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigabytes of storage. But I actually don't necessarily have a problem with that on the MacBook Air because most of the people that buy these don't care or notice. But where I do have a problem is in how much it costs to upgrade those things. You can ship me an $1,100 MacBook with 8 gigabytes of RAM, fine. But you charge $200 to go to 16, that's where the problem lies. But fortunately, thanks to the powers of time, you don't have to pay that much if you want to get either of these machines with more than the trifle 8 gigabytes of RAM or 256 of storage. So I think that's another good reason to buy used. The best feature that the M3 MacBook Air introduces is price cuts for the other two. So this video isn't one of those, oh my gosh, I can't believe Apple changed this one tiny detail that nobody's gonna notice videos, which probably means it's not gonna get that many views. But you know what? That's fine, because the goal here is to provide you guys with advice. And my advice is very simple. Buy the M3 MacBook Air if the stats that I showed you today are important to you. If not, buy an M2 or an M1 on a pretty deep discount. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.